So our first speaker is Don Baur. He's the author and editor of the ABA Treatises on the Endangered Species Act, an ocean and coastal law and policy, and has served as an adjunct professor teaching ocean law and animal law at the Vermont Law School since 1998. He's a trustee emeritus at of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation and the Shenandoah National Park Trust, and serves on the boards of the Pegasus Foundation and the Park Institute of America. He's practiced under the Marine Mammal Protection Act for 43 of its 50 years, hence him speaking about the past. Then Tim Reagan, who will follow him. He's earned a PhD in oceanography from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California in San Diego, California in 1990. He's a marine mammal biologist by training, and his dissertation focused on field and modeling studies of the northern fur seal. In 2000, he moved to Washington, D.C. to serve as the scientific program director of the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission. And then in 2006, he was appointed the commission's executive director. He retired from that position 9 years ago in 2013 and currently lives in Anacortes, Washington. Since retirement, he has continued to work for conservation of marine mammals, including the Florida manatee, the vaquita, the Maui dolphin, Pacific walrus, Sakhalin Island beluga whale, Hawaiian monk seal, and southern resident killer whale. And in January of 2022, he was appointed to the Washington State Fish and Wildlife Commission. And our final speaker today will be Francine Kershaw, who is the senior scientist for the Marine Mammal Protection Project at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and she'll be talking about the future of this statute. Francine uses the best available scientific information to advocate for improved protections for marine mammals related to a variety of issues, including ocean noise, ship strikes, and bycatch. She currently leads NRDC's work to end large whale entanglements and dedicates a large part of her portfolio to advancing responsible offshore wind development. Kershaw holds a bachelor's degree in zoology from the University of Leeds, a master's degree in biodiversity conservation and management from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Columbia University. So our first speaker is Don Baur, and he will talk about the MMPA, its first 50 years.
So when Naomi asked me to talk about the first 50 years of the MMPA, I did some quick math, and that came out to 14 seconds a year. And because I can't talk that fast, I decided instead to basically break down the history of the Act according to some chapters. And these are chapters that I've just come up with on a very subjective basis on my own. They focus on particular themes that were evolving during the 50-year history of the MMPA. There are lots of things that were happening under the MMPA during these periods. So don't think that just by the themes that I've selected or the issues that I'm talking about, that was everything that was happening under the MMPA. It's a very diverse, powerful, and action-forcing statute, and there was lots that was going on throughout its entire history. So chapter 1, of course, would be the enactment of the statute in 1972. There were several driving forces for this that caused Congress to make the decision that it was time for a comprehensive statute addressing marine mammals and marine mammal conservation. Among the leading factors that were under consideration at that time was information that had just become available about the large-scale deaths of dolphins in the U.S. tuna fishery occurring in the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. Other factors that caused Congress to get active were the dispute over international whaling and whether something should be done to establish a moratorium on whaling. The public images of the clubbing of baby harp seals in Canada attracted a lot of attention from the public and caused Congress to act. And there were a number of other issues involving marine mammals that had high visibility and called for a political response. So Congress enacted the MMPA in 1972, and it set forth its principal purposes of, first and foremost, promoting the health and stability of the marine ecosystem of which marine mammals are a part. It also set species protection objectives and had a population goal of all marine mammals reaching what's called their optimum sustainable population level, and a number of other important purposes that focused on research, international cooperation, protecting marine mammal habitat. For purposes of advancing those purposes, Congress set forth several key tools that would provide the mechanism by which the purposes would be obtained. It preempted all state law that was involving marine mammals. So only federal law would apply. There would be a truly comprehensive program governing the taking of marine mammals throughout the United States. It provides for the application of the MMPA to U.S. citizens outside of U.S. waters and operating activities on the high seas. It set the optimum sustainable population goal, and associated with that, established the depleted category of protection, which is for all marine mammals that are below their OSP level. And very importantly, it established a moratorium on all forms of take of marine mammals and importation of marine mammals, and set in place prohibitions for that purpose. The definition of take in the MMPA is hunt, capture, kill, or harass any marine mammal. And then it set forth a series of exceptions to those prohibitions. So that was the law that was established in 1972. Chapter 2, as I've defined it, really focuses on the tuna dolphin controversy. That was one of the driving forces for the MMPA. And as the agencies moved through application of the MMPA to the tuna dolphin dispute, it established several key principles that would guide implementation of the MMPA over time. Those principles were best articulated in a court decision in 1976 that challenged the first general permit that was issued to the U.S. tuna fleet to authorize the incidental take of marine mammals. These principles have continued to apply to the Act ever since. The court said that the MMPA is not a balancing test. Marine mammals always come first. Economic considerations do not drive decision-making under the MMPA. It has a very conservative bias where decisions have to be made to err on the side of the conservation of the species. The court set forth a no disadvantage test, which has to be applied to federal decisions involving marine mammals. And it put a heavy burden of proof on the parties that seek to take marine mammals or obtain permits authorizing their take. This table just indicates what happened with the tuna dolphin dispute over the years, beginning in 1972, when over 400,000 dolphins were captured and killed in the tuna fishery. If you look forward to the end of the table, by 2018, the take level, as a result of the MMPA's application, had been reduced to under 1,000 animals. Chapter 3, just want to point this out because it confirms the important role of the Marine Mammal Commission, which was established in 1972 as part of the Act. It's an independent oversight agency responsible for reviewing all federal activities affecting marine mammals. It has 3 presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed commissioners, and its recommendations to other federal agencies on actions to be taken to conserve marine mammals have to be responded to if they are not accepted, with detailed explanations. There have been 2 periods of time over the history of the MMPA when efforts were made to weaken or eliminate the Marine Mammal Commission, once in the early 1980s, which resulted in Congress amending the Act to establish very rigorous criteria for the commissioners who would be appointed to serve. And then a few years ago, under the Trump administration, efforts to zero budget the commission and put it out of business, which also were not successful in response to strong bipartisan support. So the first chapter, chapter 2 that I talked about, focusing on tuna dolphin, was looking at the issue of regulating the U.S. tuna fleet under domestic law. A big part of the problem, though, especially as the regulations under the MMPA began to kick into the U.S. fleet, was take of dolphins in the international tuna fishery operating outside of the United States. And the take levels, as they went down in the United States fleet, went up for the foreign fleets. Congress recognized this problem. The MMPA had always included a provision that required comparability between the kill rates that occurred for activities in foreign fisheries with those of the U.S., but that provision had largely been ignored. In 1984, through MMPA amendments, Congress established more priority on applying that requirement and has set a heavy burden of proof on foreign countries to prove that they were at comparable levels of take and kill. Nothing really happened under the 84 amendments, so in 1988, Congress came back again and specifically defined what would constitute comparability and set a level that the take levels for foreign fleets had to be 1.5 times the U.S. kill rate by 1990, or an embargo would come into place. Nothing happened again. There was some preliminary actions taken by the National Marine Fisheries Service to move in that direction, but it took litigation to force embargoes to actually come into effect, which it did for 12 countries as a result of that lawsuit. In 1990, the next big step forward was something that all of you are probably familiar with if you've ever bought a can of tuna in a grocery store, is the Dolphin Safe label, which was to indicate that the tuna was not caught by setting on schools of positive dolphins. There was a lot of controversy about these U.S. requirements and whether they violated principles of international free trade, which led to negotiations, which then led to the 1997 law designed to implement a dolphin safe label test and requirements under which the embargoes could be lifted. That law was then implemented through a series of different actions by the National Marine Fisheries Service in litigation challenging the service's determinations that setting on dolphins was safe and was not affecting the population. The National Marine Fisheries Service findings were overturned, and as a result, the dolphin safe label still applies only to no sets on dolphins. Regulations for the embargoes did survive litigation, and now some of the embargoes have been lifted because the foreign countries are in compliance with the terms of those U.S. regulations. While this was happening, the domestic fisheries in the United States were basically not complying with the prohibitions on take under the MMPA. So Congress established an interim exemption, and then in 1994 established a new program for authorizing incidental take in U.S. fisheries that, instead of using a permit system, established for regulation by operation of recommendations from take reduction teams that would then be implemented through regulations. So no individual permits, instead authorization of incidental take by regulation. The next chapter in the MMPA is the 1994 amendments, which included a number of provisions that weakened the authority established in the 1972 Act. Included among these was the limitation on the prohibition on take by harassment to activities occurring in the wild, and the removal of MMPA authority over captive marine mammals from the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and instead leaving it solely to the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service under the Animal Welfare Act. So the next chapter of the MMPA and its evolution since the 1994 amendments, I've listed on these slides a series of significant actions that have occurred under the MMPA since then. I'm not going to try to go through them. Much of this was driven by litigation, lawsuits brought against the federal government to enforce compliance with requirements on incidental take authorizations, to force listings under the Endangered Species Act and the MMPA as depleted, to provide greater protection to marine mammals. Litigation focused on specific species such as the vaquita, North Atlantic right whales, and southern resident killer whales. Very important international agreement on polar bear conservation in the year 2000 that was implemented through the MMPA in 2007, and many other important actions. So just to kind of wrap up, comparing the MMPA to the Endangered Species Act, when the MMPA was first enacted in 1972, it was 20 pages long. Now it's 70 pages long, and it has been amended 24 times. The Endangered Species Act, which was enacted the next year, has not been tinkered with as much. It's a very different looking statute. It includes general high-level provisions, but it does not get into the high level of detail for specific actions and program areas like the MMPA does. So I think there is a question of, is Congress getting too much into the weeds in terms of the way that the MMPA is managed and implemented, as opposed to what happens under the Endangered Species Act. So the final chapter, chapter 8, the next 50 years, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tim Reagan, who can give us his thoughts on what's going to happen for implementation, at least in the next few years, and the way the MMPA is being implemented now. And then we'll talk after that about the future of the MMPA.
If I were a painter, I would be considered an impressionist. And so I'm going to give you my impression of what's going on with the Act in a general way. And it's heavily weighted toward these more recent years when I've actually been retired. It turns out doctors discovered a hole in the back of my head, and information has been leaking at a rapid pace since then. So a lot of the past I just won't keep up with. But I will start with a note about, well, first, these are the species that I worked on and that really had a significant influence on me. Upper left is a northern fur seal. Lower left is Hawaiian monk seal. And I was the manager of the stellar sea lion recovery coordinator for the stellar sea lion on the right. As Don said, the history of the Act really has a fascinating, or is a fascinating story. And you could trace our interactions, I'm sure, back farther than the late 1800s, but I worked on fur seals, and so one of the impressions that I got was based on the work of H.W. Elliott. When we bought Alaska from the Russians in 1867, we almost immediately depleted that population, knocking it down from what was probably on the order of 1.4, 1.5 million down to about 200,000 by the turn of the century. And that led to an international treaty that was kind of a precursor for better management of marine mammals. But Don also mentioned that harp seals were a big issue. I think there have been years when, well, I can generally say hundreds of thousands of them have been harvested. There was a lot of concern about that harvest. It was eventually changed. We don't harvest these young whitecoats anymore, but we still harvest them when they're about a month of age or older. So that issue hasn't been fully resolved, I don't think. Don mentioned the large whale issue and the difficulty we had trying to manage it with the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling that was passed in 1946. And the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1972. So even in that period, we weren't able to bring it into control. And Don emphasized the importance of the dolphin kill in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. And he gave us lots of numbers. Senator Boxer years ago asked us to come up with a total of how many dolphins might have been killed during that period. And it was on the order of, when we did the count, a little over 7 million. And I tried to figure out how to put that in perspective. That's maybe 1 million less than you might find people in the New York City, or about the same number as the number of people in Tennessee or Massachusetts or Arizona. Another way I came up with to try to illustrate how many animals that was to think about lining those dolphins up. If you started in San Francisco and you lined those dolphins up, flukes to snout, one after the other, and aimed them toward Washington, D.C., how close would you get to Washington, D.C. after killing 7 million dolphins? Well, you'd get all the way to Washington, D.C. And actually then you could turn around and go all the way back to San Francisco, and then turn around again and go all the way back to Washington, D.C., and then turn around once more and get about halfway back. So that's a huge number of animals. And we did a lot of that sort of thing with northern fur seals. We went out and killed 350,000 of them. And most northern fur seal females are 350,000 females, and most of them are pregnant. So we lost the fetuses from all of those. We probably killed, estimates are about 500,000 whales in the Bering Sea and in the North Pacific. So that was a reflection of who we were at that time. And one of the things I want you to take home from this, maybe the most important thing, is that the Act now is an impression of where we are at this moment. The objective, as Don pointed out, should be to maintain the health and stability of the marine mammal ecosystem, or the marine ecosystem. A couple of things about that. It's very hard to define really what the health and stability of the marine ecosystem means. And it's also hard to define, in fact, what the marine ecosystem is. And we are getting more and more examples of why those words are not quite adequate in terms of describing what we are trying to conserve. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was one of those cases that obviously affected the health and stability of the local marine ecosystem. But there are other things that are going on. This ghostly picture is a manatee swimming through an algal bloom off Florida. And again, it's hard to say that's a healthy ecosystem. And this is a map or a couple of comparisons, or a comparison of the number of harmful algal blooms first in 1970. And you can see that we were just really starting to get an idea of what those were in the 1970 time period. By 2009, you can see how many more were there. So arguably the health and stability of our ecosystem has been declining at a pretty rapid pace. The other thing that's important to recognize about this picture is that when we talk about marine ecosystems, our scale is changing. We often think about localized ecosystems, but this is one that really is global in its effect. And we are global in our effects on the climate as well. So the notion of isolated marine ecosystems is applicable in so many cases where we're dealing with difficult conservation issues. Our focus really almost has to shift, at least in part, to the global environment. It's also changed because the notion of what is a marine ecosystem is changing. This is an example based on Chinook salmon. Chinook are important in their own right. They're also at the center of controversy over the southern resident killer whale. And they use much of the Pacific for foraging and growing, but when they return, they also include large areas of land masses, riverine ecosystems, reaching all the way into Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and so on. So now our marine ecosystem includes a great deal of land. And if you look at the drainage for the Mississippi and the Missouri and a number of other rivers that flow into the Mississippi and then into the Gulf of Mexico, you can see that all those rivers combined drain about 40% of the landmass of the lower 48. And so our whole concept of localized ecosystems is valuable in some cases, but if we are not paying attention to the large scale issues, we're going to be in trouble. And I think everybody is recognizing that, but I don't know that we deal with it quite as well as we should. All this brings up the question of habitat. I personally think that the Endangered Species Act has been a much more useful law when dealing with habitat for endangered species because it identifies critical habitats and sets some obvious constraints or more obvious constraints on what you can and cannot do. The Marine Mammal Protection Act mentions habitat. A number of cases, I think I did a search and it shows up on 16 different pages of the act, but it doesn't give you the teeth that you need when you're trying to deal with many of the issues, like with the Salish Sea region. We don't really refer to habitat under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Of course, that's mostly an issue that deals with the endangered, or governed by the Endangered Species Act. But still, just simply to say efforts should be made to protect essential habitats, including rookeries, mating grounds, and areas of similar significance. That isn't as helpful, I think, as it might be in that scenario where I would think that we really need to improve the act. The one case where I was pleased to see it was is in stock assessment, section 117, and there we are supposed to be describing the factors that may be causing a decline or impeding recovery, including effects of marine mammal habitat and prey. But if you look at the stock assessments, you will rarely see really in-depth descriptions of our effects on marine mammal habitat and prey. We have a long way to go there. So habitat is an issue that I think needs a lot of work. The risks, you all know them. They are it's obvious now, or really more so than they were years ago. In fact, there are more and more as we go, or we're recognizing more and more, but there are still standard risks. Fishing, and I use the case of the vaquita, fishing that was not managed in terms of its bycatch and now may have led to, well, has led to the near extinction. And honestly, I don't know that we really know how many there are, but everybody says less than 10. But we've been saying that for a couple of years for a really rapidly declining population. Who knows if there are that many left? You know, ship strikes. You know about disease. We should all be tuned into disease, but I don't know that we have a great deal better handle on some of the new diseases like toxoplasmosis, et cetera. Entanglement is one that's important to me. These are pictures that I took. The animal on the lower left, its neck was cut by a single strand of cotton string. Animals get wrapped around or get into these nets and debris when they are small, and then they grow. And this happens so over a period of months and years. It's a pretty awful thing. Disturbance and noise is an issue for killer whales or military activities. And for me, probably one of the most important is when we consider what the threats are, the most important issues of the day, we're so overwhelmed with so many other things that I don't know that we focus enough on some of the conservation. At least as a society, it's really hard for us to handle more than 2, 3, I would say almost at the most, major issues at a time. And we really need to be looking at what are driving those things. We look at the proximate causes, but are we looking at the ultimate causes, which I think is us? We are in for a backlash because of the growth of a recovery of some populations and their effect on other endangered populations. The Bonneville Dam, the sea lion, salmon issue is a big one that will illustrate that, and the call for culls will illustrate that. Don mentioned, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think our problem with the act is as much the implementation now as it is what the Act says it says. I think the Act is actually wonderful. It's been greatly successful in terms of dealing with direct take. Indirect take is a much more difficult challenge for us. And we also have to be willing to implement it. We know that we have vessels that are harassing southern resident killer whales purposefully. We still allow that to happen, even though the Act says it should not. We also are struggling mightily with this issue of assessing the advancements of other countries in terms of how they manage their fishing technology, such as the Maui dolphin off of New Zealand. Lastly, this is my last slide. I will just say that we have to be really careful that we are not letting our values influence our science, but we also have to be careful that we are not letting our values override the laws and the science that we're doing. And I think that's the position that we are always finding ourselves in, especially with endangered species. People's values, people don't know the Marine Mammal Protection Act. They don't know the Endangered Species Act. They almost have to relearn all of these things. And lots of times our values override that tendency to do that. So that for me is one of the great threats to marine mammals. So I'm going to quit there and turn it over to Francine. Francine, it's all yours.
Okay, so I've been asked and tasked with looking ahead to some of the challenges we may face in the next 50 years and to think about some of the conservation solutions we might like to, and in many cases need to advance to tackle them. And Tim, I really appreciated your last slide there, because I think it sets a wonderful framework for us to have in the back of our mind as we move forward through these slides. So our ocean is changing rapidly and in significant ways, including areas in and around the United States. When Arctic sea ice reached its minimum extent on September 15, 2020, it was the second lowest minimum since the start of the satellite record in 1979. And in recent decades, Arctic melting seasons have been growing longer, and much of the older, thicker ice has now been lost. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 96% of the world's ocean. The warming is leading to changes in community composition, including for commercial fisheries, as well as the distribution of Calanus, which is a species of zooplankton that is the preferred prey of the North Atlantic right whale, which is critically endangered. And a marine heat wave in the Northeast Pacific created an unprecedented mass of warm, nutrient-poor water that emerged off the Pacific coast from around 2013 onwards. You may have heard this called the blob in common parlance. But this marine heat wave caused ecosystem-wide food web disruptions, leading to the mass mortality of seabirds and a suite of other fish, mammal, and bird species during 2014 all the way through 2017. And then in addition to warming, there are other issues, of course, such as increased ocean acidification, which is likely to have significant impacts on species foundational to many of the marine food chains. Marine mammals are already experiencing the effects of these changes. Hawaiian monk seals are losing important coastal habitat where they raise and care for their pups due to inundation and erosion caused by sea level rise. At the French frigate shoals in 2018, only 57% of pups born survive to weaning, whereas that percentage averages around 95% throughout the rest of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. Peaks of phocine distemper virus in seals, sea lions, and sea otters has been found to correspond with reduction in sea ice extent, rather surprisingly, I think. And this is an example indicating how little we know about how climate change will affect marine mammal health in the future. And off the East Coast, North Atlantic right whales are coming into increased conflict with fishing gear and vessels as they try to track their rapidly shifting prey, primarily those Calanus species mentioned on the previous slide. These interactions are currently driving the species rapidly towards extinction. And human behavior is changing too. So as Arctic ice melts, for example, there will need to be an increased need for military defense that will introduce harmful Navy sonar and explosives into what now represents some of the quietest remaining ocean on Earth. And new vessel routes will also open up, and indeed are already planned, as shown here in the figure. And this is going to increase the risk of vessel strike and even more noise in the Arctic environment. So noise from vessels, military exercises, and other human activities is particularly concerning for marine mammals in the Arctic, as they've been exposed to very little noise to date, and so they can be expected to be disproportionately affected. New industries like aquaculture and offshore wind are also on the horizon in the US, and indeed offshore wind is rapidly taking off as we speak. And the potential effects on marine mammals and the broader ecosystem for both of these industries is largely unknown. So we need solutions that are responsive to these dynamic conditions and uncertainties. And we're going to explore 3 conservation challenges and possible solutions during the remainder of the talk today. And these 3 topics are by no means comprehensive. There is unfortunately a much longer list than what is listed here, but they were chosen because I think they reflect an interesting breadth of challenges and possible conservation tools and solutions. So the first is managing populations and species at significant risk from climate change. As already stated, many marine mammals are already experiencing the effects of climate change, and some, like this ice-dependent spotted seal here, acutely so. But we don't yet have a good understanding of how climate change will impact marine mammals writ large. And so this poses a significant challenge for the development and implementation of adequate conservation and management measures. So one potential solution is to develop climate impact management plans for the most vulnerable species and populations. These plans would include not only conservation and recovery actions to mitigate climate impacts, but also actions to monitor, reduce, and prevent conflicts with other harmful human activities that may occur or increase due to climate change or are already existing. And reducing existing threats to marine mammals will help bolster their resiliency to other impacts in the future, including the less predictable impacts of climate change. So we'd be giving them the best chance to deal with all of these additional stresses. As climate change is also having significant effects on marine mammal prey, including in terms of distribution and prey quality, it would also be helpful to create plans to specifically monitor and manage prey availability. And as we still have significant gaps in knowledge, a running theme of this talk, I feel like, regarding emerging threats to marine mammals, it could be very helpful to develop a report that could be presented to Congress that synthesizes what we do know, identifies gaps, and then makes recommendations for actionable conservation measures, or indeed work that we would need to do to fill those knowledge gaps. The next challenge is reducing the risk of vessel strikes and vessel noise. So vessels are both an existing threat and also an emerging threat in some areas like the Arctic. Vessel strikes can injure and kill animals. Large whales are the most vulnerable marine mammals, and several species in all regions of the United States are currently experiencing unsustainable mortalities resulting from vessel strikes. Vessels also generate significant levels of underwater noise that can drown out other sounds in the ocean over large distances from the vessel. And these include the sounds marine mammals use to communicate, find their prey, socialize, do everything they need to do to survive and thrive. And the harmful air emissions associated with vessels are, of course, contributing towards climate change, further exacerbating these other threats. So luckily, there are a wide range of solutions to help tackle the impacts of vessels on marine mammals and the broader ecosystem. Solutions include slowing down to 10 knots or less to reduce the risk and severity of vessel strike. And this is currently the most effective available way to significantly reduce vessel strike risk. Slowing vessels down also has the co-benefits of reducing underwater noise as well as air emissions. So it's a win-win-win. We can also work with ports and the shipping and maritime industries to incentivize vessel slowdowns and to adopt new quieting technologies. And there are some excellent examples of this approach already working, including through the Enhancing Cetacean Habitat and Observation, or ECHO program run by the Port of Vancouver. And we can also work to improve visual and acoustic tracking of where whales are in real time to help trigger vessel slowdowns and increase mariner awareness when a whale is detected. And this is becoming increasingly important as the distributions of large whales are shifting significantly, and they're now in areas that they were not before or for longer periods of time. And it would be remiss of me not to mention that the Marine Mammal Commission held a webinar earlier this week that dives into this issue and many solutions listed here in more detail. And I recommend you check out the recording that will be posted on their website if it hasn't been already, if you're interested. So then the last challenge is imposing reasonable limits on marine mammal deterrence. Deterrents are used to scare marine mammals, largely seals, but other small cetaceans and in some cases large whales away from fishing areas. They can cause direct harm to both target species and non-target species, such as the harbour poppers here on the slide. And their use has been increasing in recent years, partly because several seal populations have been recovering, and so perceived interactions with fisheries has also increased. They're also a common tool used in aquaculture sites in Europe and other regions around the world. So as aquaculture expands here in the US, the increased use of deterrents may occur or may be proposed to occur. The Marine Mammal Protection Act currently allows virtually unlimited take of marine mammals using deterrents. In addition, impacts to marine mammal habitat, as Tim mentioned, which is just so important, and also non-target species are not taken into account. And an assessment of the effectiveness of the deterrent being used or being proposed to be used isn't required. So solutions to this problem are some relatively simple questions that need to be answered, determining the effectiveness of deterrents and only authorizing the use of those that are effective, prohibiting those deterrents that have significant adverse impacts to marine mammals and their habitats. And it's important here to include the consideration of sublethal effect, like chronic stress or disruptive feeding ability, not just direct mortality or injury. And then also fully assessing the impacts on non-target species. And the cumulative impacts of deterrents also need to be accounted for. For example, when they're being used by multiple fishermen in the same area. And just to illustrate the cumulative nature of this problem, passive acoustic monitoring data at multiple sites within Southern California relatively recently documented 12,000 to 37,000 seal bomb explosions per month at various fishing sites, with as many as 3,000 explosions in a single night at one fishing site. So the cumulative impacts here can be really significant. Okay, to quickly summarize, because I see I'm almost out of time. So the MMPA is effective, but it does need to be future-proofed to respond to new challenges posed by the direct and indirect effects of climate change. Protecting marine mammal habitat and reducing cumulative and chronic stresses will help increase the resiliency of marine mammals to help them cope with what's to come. And fortunately, there is a wide range of innovative solutions and tools that can be used to address current and anticipated impacts to marine mammals. And work should start now to both address existing threats, in that case work needs to continue and in some areas be strengthened, but also to help us have the tools ready to go when emerging threats and other impacts occur. So with that, I'll pause there and I'll hand back over to Naomi. Thank you so much.
Okay, everyone. I hope that you've learned a lot. I think that these were great talks about a rather amazing piece of legislation that nevertheless, is working in the real world, and there's always issues related to that. And there were a lot of questions coming through on the Q&A, which I will pass on to the speakers. I think one of the themes I've seen is, why doesn't the Marine Mammal Protection Act do more? And sometimes it's a matter of political will. It's not just so much that the law isn't strong enough on paper. It's just that when it's implemented and enforced, politics sometimes enters the picture. So in fact, I'll start by asking the panel, and anybody can answer this. How do you feel the MMPA compares to other nations' protections for marine mammals?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. I think it's generally better, and we like to think that it provides an example for other nations and that they're willing to follow it. But we get right back into that dilemma that you just mentioned, Naomi, where we have to look and see what the priorities are for those other nations. I will use the example of New Zealand. I've been engaged in that as an issue for the last year. And the problem there is the take of Maui dolphins in gill nets and trawls. And the problems with that are largely, in my mind, the lack of observer effort. It is one thing to have standards. New Zealand has its own Marine Mammal Protection Act, but it is another one to implement those standards. The act is only as good as its implementation. And so there's a case where some of us have felt that New Zealand could have done more. We clearly felt that way about Mexico with the vaquita, that despite the fact that we knew they were killing large numbers of vaquita annually, going from something like an estimate of 567 in the early 1990s to now about 10 in a pretty steady decline. We could not convince the Mexican government to make the changes that were necessary to prevent that. Canada, I would say, is in some respects similar to ours, to our efforts, but it varies depending on the species. They've done some good things on the southern resident killer whale lately, and we should be cooperating more with them on that. But they also have the same kind of history that we had. I can't tell you as much about the UK right now, but I can say that we get great science and wonderful help out of the UK from their scientists about understanding these issues on a worldwide basis. We've got a real need to engage more in Asia, in Africa, to improve measures there so that there's greater hope, better hope of some conservation. You know, with the Baiji, that we saw that coming for years and we weren't able to turn that around. So I would say the US in some ways has on paper a pretty good act, but again, I really want the audience to know that with science and with all of our conservation measures, if they do not affect the animal and their habitat, then we are just kidding ourselves. And when we look at what we should be doing under these acts, I think that's the case in lots of situations, even for us.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Thank you, Tim. You made many of the points and provided a more global overview than I was able to, so I appreciate that. I agree. You know, I think the MMPA has strong standards. It's very comprehensive. It covers all marine mammals. It's incredibly comprehensive, which is, you know, if not unique, is rare. I think it's action forcing. It has independent oversight. Has international reach through its MMPA import provision, and it generates a lot of scientific knowledge. There's a requirement in there to produce stock assessment reports for every marine mammal stock, and that just generates so much research and monitoring and science, which is incredibly helpful. But I completely agree with Tim. The crux is in the implementation of the MMPA, and you know, as we've touched on in these talks, there are ways that permitting under the MMPA could be improved to better account for cumulative impact and to ensure that kind of permitted industry actions really are having the least practicable impact that they can on marine mammal stocks and populations. And I'll harken back to Don's slide about Congress micromanaging the MMPA, and that I think there is some influence there that favors industry interests, at least on occasion, that, you know, could be strengthened a little bit.
Thank you. I also want to point out that we have Mike Goslinger with us today. He is the current General Counsel with the Marine Mammal Commission, and he's also willing to answer questions. So Mike, do you want to say anything about this question? And then I'm going to move on to another.
I think the only thing I would add is that just like in the US, we're kind of schizophrenic, and two of the issues I've worked on over the years, it kind of it varies from issue to issue. I don't think you can just say countries are doing a great job or they're doing a bad job. And two of the issues I work on are IWC and polar bears, and specifically implementation of the international treaties we have on those. And Norway is a very interesting example. You know, they're seen as major exploiters and corner cutters in the world of whaling, where you know, they're put in the camp of pushing against things, even in terms of transparency and involvement of NGOs. And in the polar bear world, they're kind of on the cutting edge of, we need to address climate change, we need to reduce take, even if it's for subsistence use, and you know, they're on polar opposites depending upon the perspective of the country and their exploitation level of the species involved. So I think it's really difficult to draw to lump countries in, oh, they're doing a great job on everything. I think everyone has a layer of pragmatism to what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. Political will, pragmatism, economics, and so on. In sort of consistent with that question about other countries, we have these comparability standards, and the MMPA allows us to, deal with trade in other marine products if they don't have comparable standards, as Don mentioned. So one of the questions that has arisen a couple of times is about the Faroe Islands. And do we import seafood from them? And if we do, how does that work because of the hunt there for pilot whales?
Well, I'll jump in because I absolutely do not. I mean, everybody knows about the Faroe Islands. What do I call it? Hunt, harvest. And I think it poses a real challenge. But I also, I think it could be lined up with lots of countries where we really need to take a look at how that happens. Having been sort of repulsed by it myself, I can honestly say that it has never been the issue that I've focused on. So I would need to take a hard look at what they're doing and what their justifications are in order to make a firm judgment. And I want to say, okay, that suggests that maybe I haven't been looking hard at all the problems around the world, but in fact, I don't know that that's the case. It's more a matter of there are so many challenges that we're facing that getting ahead of this one is something that has slipped through the cracks a bit. So if I were back in a management position and I was focused on this comparability issue, I think that should be a really high priority to take a look at what are they doing and how do they justify that and how does it work under their act. And I would agree that if it does not meet our standards, then they really should be not allowed to export fish products to us. But not having gone through that process, I think the process is important. And one of the difficulties that we run into is that the statement that requires that was in the 1972 Act. We're now 50 years later, and the move to sort of implement that part of the act has really only been in the last, decade, Mike? You can tell me more accurately, but we're way behind on that. And we should be looking more rigorously at it. But so far, I don't know that that's been done. It'd be a good question to ask the people who are struggling with international issues out of NIMS, because they'll be able to tell you, I think, reasonably what's been going on there.
And so we're done with the webinar. However, I will tell you all, the folks who are still listening, that if you follow the hashtag MMPA50, hashtag MMPA50, then you will see an archive of this recording. We are recording this webinar, and you will be able to watch it again. And also, depending on where you find it, whether it's on a Twitter feed or a Facebook page, you'll be able to ask questions, and we'll try to get you the answers, even from these panelists who may be able to give a better answer than we can. So thank you all for coming. I'm really sorry we didn't have more time for questions, but the presentations were great. And I hope you all leave this webinar with a better understanding of this statute here in the United States, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is 50 years old this year. And again, follow that hashtag MMPA50, and we will be offering more educational and more action-oriented posts and tweets and Instagram posts as the year continues. The actual anniversary is in October, so we're going to try to continue to offer you content throughout the rest of the year. Thank you very much, everybody. Francine, Tim, Mike, Don, and the person who actually put this on was Kim Mineo of AWI, so I really thank her. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.